Destiny raps, but our country half asleep is only dimly conscious of the sound. It does not realize the importance of the guest. For these are the leisurely days of 1898, the horse and wagon days, and this insistent rapping gives no hint of faster, more exciting times ahead. The sound at the door is now the distant boom of cannon. It is May 2nd, 1898, and American ships and Admiral Dewey are in Manila Bay. Headlines, bands, parades, and still we do not realize how great a destiny has called. For then the Philippines seemed but unimportant islands on the far distant borders of the Pacific Ocean. We were at war to get the Spaniards out of nearby Cuba and not, as Congress had already declared, to acquire a new and distant domain. Then why should we anticipate that this knock is destiny? Thus, without our planning, we found ourselves with the Philippines, a problem and a responsibility. Some Americans doubtless thrilled with the thought that now our flag might fly over distant outposts. Some commercial interests saw possibilities for profits in the undeveloped resources of these islands. But the American people wanted no land which could not become an integral part of the United States, nor any subject people. They held the American tradition that all just government derives its authority from the consent of the governed. Despite wavering, this underlying purpose has not changed. After the war, the Senate passed a resolution
to prepare the Philippines for self-government and in due course to make such disposition as will best promote the interests of the citizens of the United States and the inhabitants of said island.
To the commission sent out to set up a provisional government, President McKinley said
that the government which you are establishing is designed not for our satisfaction, nor for the expression of our theoretical views, but for the happiness, peace, and prosperity of the islands.
Thus was born the policy of the Philippines for the Filipinos. From that day, the degree of Filipino self-government has continually increased until in 1934, the Tidings-McDuffie Law provided for complete independence in 1946. The occasion for this bill was the self-interest of certain groups, but the action accorded with 35 years of American thinking, and it quickly became a law. In signing this bill, President Roosevelt remarked, "This is a great day for the Philippines. It means the beginning of the Philippine Republic." Could he then have realized that it was destiny rapping on our door, he would have known that this too was a great day for America. The future, however, was veiled in darkness. Hindenburg was president of Germany when the Filipinos were promised their independence. Japan was still a member of the League of Nations. Italy had not yet gone into Abyssinia. There had been no civil war in Spain. That storm of events which was to get started. Now then, in 1898, could anyone know that in the Spanish-American War, we were viewing much more than the end of Spain's colonial empire? That within 50 years, we would see the twilight of all imperialism. For we had come to the end of that fabulous age born of the adventures of Da Gama, Columbus, and Magellan. Ahead awaited those titanic struggles which must precede the new world order in which all races work out their own destinies in friendly cooperation. Thus we come to the Philippines and the role of the United States in them. Altogether, they are about the size of the British Isles. Luzon at the north and Mindanao at the south comprise more than half the total area. 9 other islands, though much smaller, each contain over 1,200 square miles. Of the 7,000 or more islands remaining, nearly 95% are of less than 1 square mile. The peoples of the Philippines are a blend of Mongoloid and Indonesian races and cultures, drawing inspiration from both China and India. The fast disappearing Aborigines are represented by these pygmy negritos, who now comprise less than 1% of the total population. This is one of their villages. These people have always been hunters rather than farmers, and rely greatly on their bows and poisoned arrows. They gather wild honey in the forests, using smudges from green branches to make the smoke which will protect them from the bees. Among the early Malay immigrants were the pagan Igorots, still found in considerable numbers in the more remote hills and valleys of Luzon. The Igorots, after the manner of the Chinese, build and maintain remarkable rice terraces on the slopes of the island. In recent years, they have made outstanding advancement and show great promise. Rice is a favorite food, and they feast in this primitive fashion. The Malays of the southern islands are Mohammedans and were called by the Spaniards Moors or Moros. Their headmen bear the trappings and titles of nobility, and as true Muslims still maintain the harem. Here is a Moro fishing village with houses built on piles. The Moros find cheap and plentiful food in the many varieties of fish which abound in Philippine waters. As boatmen with their small outrigger craft, they have few equals and no superiors. The Igorots and the Moros, though minority groups, are typical of the old Malay stock on which the Filipino race is founded. Seven or 8 centuries ago, the Chinese began coming in by way of Formosa. They are famous merchants, and many natives show distinct traces of Chinese ancestry. In 1520, at the spot where this monument and shrine now stand, Magellan the Spaniard first landed on these islands. "44 years later, Legazpi made the first settlement. Soldiers and priests, the Spaniards came seeking profits and bringing Christianity. Since the Filipinos of the North and Central Islands feared the Muslims of the South, they welcomed the Spaniards. For over 375 years, with the exception of but 1 year, the Spaniards were in full control of the Philippines. Beautiful churches still in use are the outstanding outward marks of this long rule. The influence of a common ritual and a common faith in unifying these strains into one people cannot be overestimated. Today, over 90 out of each 100 people in the islands classify themselves as Christians, and nearly 80% are Catholics. As such, the Filipinos are the only Christian nation in the Orient. This is San Tomas College, older than any in the United States. Education, however, was not brought to the masses. The Spaniards instituted a feudal system of great land holdings, and a common sight in those days was a native moving his hut with the help of his neighbors. For though he owned his simple house, he could not own the land he farmed. A great influence was the intermarriage of Spaniards and Chinese with the native Malays, a mixture which produced many of the island's social, business, and political leaders. The blending of this culture is reflected in this Tagalog folk song. The islands which form the Philippine group are in a general way the uplifted crests of two parallel mountain ranges running from north to south. In and near these mountain ranges are large and rich deposits of gold, iron, copper, chromium, and manganese. The Filipinos work the iron ore in this simple fashion. Because there is no coal for commercial smelting, these ores are shipped abroad. But the greatest wealth of the Philippines is to be found in its climate and its soil. Lying 300 to 1,500 miles north of the equator, the island climate is continuously but not unbearably warm, with trade winds bringing frequent and heavy rains. Nearly half the island area is covered with valuable forests of tropical woods and bamboo groves. In the days of Spaniards as today, the great export or money crops of the islands were sugar, copra from coconuts, hemp, and tobacco in the north. In those days, the many sugar plantations produced unrefined sugar only, and sugar raising, while important, was not then as important as today. Coconuts grew nearly everywhere. And it was a common sight to see rafts of nuts floating down the river to Manila. To make the famous Manila hemp, the leaves of the abaca palm, a plant related to the banana, were cut and its fibers stripped in this fashion. The tobacco used in Manila fillers was grown and cured in the valleys of Luzon. Besides these cash crops, the principal home food crops were rice, corn, and bananas. Rice paddies were planted and harvested in primitive fashion by the caribou or water buffalo. Over half the area of the Philippines is suited to agriculture, but only 11% is under cultivation, even though the Filipinos do not produce enough rice to supply their needs. On the higher and drier lands, corn was the staple grain, while in nearly every place, bananas grew with a minimum of care. The Filipinos were skilled artisans. Clever wood carvers are found even among the more primitive tribes, and there are gifted workers in metal. In the making of fine embroidery, the women of the Philippines have become world famous. These were the Philippines which the United States acquired when destiny knocked that day in 1898. The bullet holes in these walls are mute reminders of Spanish-American war days and the fear of many Filipinos that they were then but acquiring a stronger foreign rule. As a first act, the United States bought and sold at cost to the farmers who had worked them the great land holdings of the church. Then the tariff bars were let down and the Filipino farmer enjoyed free trade in the great American market. This put sugar raising into first rank. However, over half the capital invested in this industry is owned by the Filipino, less than 20% by Americans. While there are some large plantations, a great part of the farms average less than 10 acres each. Under American guidance, the beautiful harbor of Manila was improved, and steamship and airlines were established or extended to bring the Philippines closer to the rest of the world. In the interior, railroads, street lines, and bus lines, together with over 10,000 miles of good automobile road, were built to join the various communities of the islands. Modern city streets and buildings are evidence of the prosperity that American occupation has brought. But because of our policy toward the Philippines, ownership has more and more tended to rest in native hands. Less than 15% of the banks are American-owned. American cooperation has not been entirely commercial. Many hospitals and sanitariums have been established throughout the islands, and medical help is available to nearly everyone in need. On the site of the old Spanish fort and moat at Manila is this up-to-date recreation and playground. With the first provisional government came a ship loaded with 1,000 American teachers. Schools were built where boys and girls, Oriental by race, could get an Occidental outlook toward the world and so help to make a bridge of understanding between the old world and the new. Normal schools trained native teachers to carry on the educational program. Under the American and Philippine flags here in review before President Quezon marched the Philippines' own army. American trained, but with its own flag and loyalty. With them are the famous constabulary, who have put down violence and banditry, bringing for the first time in over 1,000 years universal law and order. This legislative building stands for 45 years of training in free government and in the principles of fair elections and courts of equal justice without fear and without bribery. And here to the strains of the Philippine national anthem were signed in 1935 those resolutions accepting independence. Destiny knocked. America with much hesitation answered, and lo, the United States and the Philippines as fellow republics stand upon the threshold of the Far East. The dramatic value of that vision upon the future of the Pacific is beyond calculation. Look at the strategic place of the Philippines in regard to its neighbors. Immediately you'll note that it forms with the coast of China the sides of a narrow passage through which all sea traffic must pass, en route from Japan to the south or east. Japan, standing on our home shores, looks to these islands as essential stepping stones between herself and Australia. She would like to march down through these islands. Alert forces at Australia bar her way. They will yet turn her in her steps and drive her back over the same path. Here is the island of Corregidor. Beyond are the hills and foxholes of Bataan. The gallant stand of the Filipino troops with MacArthur is final evidence that full faith and mutual confidence have ripened between that Malay nation and ourselves. At last, despite isolated sets of self-interest, we have made good our promise. The Philippines for the Filipinos. In these dark hours, they hear and trust the promise of our President that their freedom will be redeemed and their independence established and protected, and that the entire resources of the United States stand behind that pledge. These words of hope and courage are also heard by the millions of China and India, now seeking their rightful place in the family of nations. For the new order which we have pledged to the Philippines, based on cooperation rather than exploitation, is the pattern of the new day toward which the free nations of this world are marching. This is the dawn of freedom of opportunity to all peoples. To paraphrase the creed of a great American, as a house divided against itself cannot stand, so this world community of nations cannot permanently endure, half slave and half free. Slavery shall not extinguish the light of liberty. Destiny leads. We march to a free world of free nations.